Welcome back to the English Cybersecurity Podcast. This is episode 9 of our podcast. And in this podcast, we aim to make cybersecurity understandable for everyone, even you. All right, my name is Eric English, and today's date is August 1st of 2025. Today we're going to be diving into a deeper dive into network security. And as I stated previously, we're just building on previous episodes, going a little bit deeper into each topic and each concept, and just slowly expanding on each item so that we're not trying to do too much at once. So today, network security is the primary focus. We're going to deep dive into that. And if we have time, we'll try to get into some identity security, but we'll see if we have time for that. Network security can be a very big topic, so we'll see how far along we get here. So I guess to start things off here, the biggest part of, I would say, network security is understanding not only, IP addresses, what's an internal address, what's an external address, but all the ports and protocols and services that run on those ports. Those are the types of things. It's very basic information. However, if you know what's running on a certain port, that can help you either try to hack whatever service is running on that port or help secure it if you're on the blue team. So we're going to dive into this a little bit deeper here. So let's start with IP address ranges first. So IP addresses are, the way that the internet communicates is via IP addresses, right? TCP/IP is what's used on the internet. We have IP version 4. And then IP version 6, which is a much bigger address space. So IPv6, you're going to have billions and billions of IP addresses that you can use. Those IPv6 addresses are also much harder to memorize than the previous IP version 4 addresses. So, for example, IP version 4 is, 192.168.1.1 is a very simple one. Whereas IP version 6 is going to be, a lot longer, and I can't even prattle one off right now because I don't have any of them memorized. It's not something that it's very easy to memorize. But this is also why we have DNS. DNS helps translate a friendly name like google.com to an IP address, as we talked about previously. So that's why DNS is so important, because we can't remember these crazy IPv6 IP addresses. There's no way. So all you got to remember is google.com. It's much more simple. But as far as IP version 4, IPv4 is still primarily used on the internet. We are slowly moving to IPv6. And what you'll also find too is most internal networks are still using IPv4 as well. So what is an internal IPv4 address? Well, there's a few different ranges. So we'll kind of start slow here, but the first one that comes to mind for me is the 10. So 10.0.0.1 and anything that starts with 10. So that first octet. So in IP addresses, they call them octets, right? So if you break it down into binary, there's 8 bits, right? So each little octet, so 10 dot whatever. So 10 is an octet, right? Dot 0 is another octet. Dot 0 is another octet, and dot 1 is the last octet. And again, you break that down into binary, and you'll understand why that's called an octet. But regardless, anything that starts with a 10 is an internal IP address. One of the other easy ones to remember is a 192.168. Anything that starts with 192.168 is an internal IP address. And your last one is 172.16. And then the 172.16, that one actually goes all the way up to 172.31. So it could be 172.16.0.1 all the way to 172.31.255.255. And in these IP addresses, the IP version 4, 255 is typically the highest you can go, but it's also 255 is your broadcast address, so you're typically going to stop at 254. And then your gateway address is in there, and you can do subnetting and things like that. We're not going to dive too deep into subnetting. That's a whole nother can of worms that is very hard to actually verbally teach subnetting. However, there's plenty of tools online if you need to learn about subnetting, and I do recommend at least understanding what some of the basic subnets are that you'll run across. But again, let's go back to the IP addresses first before we get into subnetting. So again, anything that starts with 10, so 10.0.0.0 all the way to 10.255.255.255. Those are all internal IP addresses. So you can use those on your internal network behind your firewall. You cannot use a 10 address or a 192.168 or a 172.16. You cannot use those on the public internet. They will not work. So there are other ranges that will not work on the internet, but the vast majority of everything else will work on the internet. They have different classes of IP addresses and things like that too that you can dive into. But we're going to try to keep it, again, we're diving in a little bit deeper, but I'm not going to go too crazy into subnetting and things like that. But we do want to understand, what is CIDR notation? You may or may not have heard of this before. But it's when someone says, "Oh, I've got, what's your internal IP range?" And you can say, "Oh, it's 10.0.0.0/24." Well, the /24 is what is considered CIDR notation. So what is CIDR notation? CIDR notation, if I remember right, it's been a little while, but I'm so used to calling it CIDR, I don't really remember the acronym. It's classless interdomain routing, I think, is what CIDR stands for. It's not the cider drink that you're thinking of. It's CIDR. So yeah, it's classless interdomain routing. I think I've got that right. But anyway, the CIDR notation basically notates the subnet that you're on. So /24 is probably the most common internal IP range. You may run into a /16, which gives you a lot more internal IP addresses. That would be typically reserved for a very large organization. But most folks use a /24. You get 254 addresses in a /24. But you do have to consider, if you have, let's say, more than 254 devices on a single network, well, guess what? That /24 is not going to work for you. So if you work at a bigger company, you're probably going to use larger address spaces, like a /16, for example. There are plenty of others that you can use. You can use a /8 if you wanted to have even more IP addresses. But anyway, there's lots of different ways to subnet things. And again, it all depends on how many devices and IP addresses you're going to be using on that particular subnet or that particular network. So to kind of dive into that a little bit more, if you work at a building and you're on, the 5th floor, for example, and on that 5th floor, you've got 400 people. Well, guess what? A /24 with 254 IP addresses is not going to be enough for 400 or 500 people, right? Each person, you can assume, is going to have at least one device with them. So you're going to need at least 400 to 500 IPs, and people are probably going to have their phone with them. They're probably going to have a printer nearby. You're going to have a few servers. You may have some, other devices out there for people to use, scanners and whatnot, copiers, you name it, fax machines, all that kind of fun stuff. So you have to really plan these things out when you're building a network. You need to understand and kind of guesstimate, and you have to also plan for growth. Especially if you're at a company that is growing fast, you need to make sure that you're not going to handcuff yourself with a small IP block that is just going to get filled up very quickly. So again, small businesses, a /24 is probably fine. And you can even subnet per, like if you have a multi-story building, let's say, and you've got the first 5 floors are for your company. Well, each floor can have its own subnet, right? So you can do a /24 on one of the floors and a /16 on the other. But all that's really doing, when you look at subnetting, the /24, the /16, /8, whatever you're looking at, it just gives you more IP addresses to use. So in a /24, like I said, you've got technically 255 addresses, but only 254 really usable, and really even 253 are actually usable because one's the gateway. One's gateway, one's broadcast. So 253 addresses that you can use. If you got more devices than that, well, that /24 is not going to work, right? So you have to, again, really just plan that out. A slash 16, that'll get you, I believe it's 65,500 and some odd IP addresses to use. That's way plenty. Almost overkill, right? So you have to kind of pick a middle ground, right? So maybe a slash 16 is too much. You just have to kind of figure out what works best for you. But I would recommend checking out any kind of like subnet mask calculator, anything like that, to kind of help you figure out how many usable IP addresses you're gonna get with that particular subnet that you're gonna use, and then really figure out the best way to architect. If you're building a network, do you want to have a separate subnet for each floor? Do you want it to be all on one subnet? It's really up to you how you do it. Now, if you're subnetting each floor, that can be a little more complex. You have to have a lot more routing and switching in between. So whereas if it's just one big subnet, then it's a little less of that. However, you do want to segment your traffic a little bit too. That's just kind of best practice. You wouldn't want to have, let's say, like for example, IoT devices on your primary network. You'd want to have them on their own segmented subnet or network that does not interact with your user subnets. All the workstations and servers and things like that. And even you can subnet your printers onto their own subnet, your servers onto their own subnet. And you can get really, really complex with it if you choose to. Now, what does that have to do with security? Not a whole lot, really. It's good to understand it, though, so that you know how these different networks are talking to each other, so that if you needed to investigate something, you can easily go and investigate that because you understand, oh, this is a slash 16. Oh, goodness, I got 65,000 IP addresses I can use. All right, this is going to take me a while to investigate. Or, hey, this is a slash 24 and it's routing over to here. There's connections coming in through this network, so on and so forth. It just helps you with, painting the picture of that particular network that you're in and helping you troubleshoot or even investigate things and really just understand how things are laid out. This also helps you when you're trying to, implement, let's say, firewall controls or any other kind of network security controls, because you need to know what networks you're going to apply those controls to. So there's a ton of different things we can dive into. Anyway, IP addressing is a massive topic, but that's just scratching the surface. I would highly recommend learning about the different CIDR notations and how many IP addresses you get in each one. And then just kind of understanding, again, what's an internal IP address and what's an external IP address. I've worked at places where, someone came in and didn't quite understand what a public IP was. And they actually used a public IP address range on the internal network. So behind their firewall, everything had I forget what it was now, but let's say it was like a 24.1.1.1, whatever it was. Well, 24 is a public IP range, right? We're not going to be using that on the internal network. So, and the reason you don't want to do that is because if there's a website out there that has, that particular subnet or that particular IP address, let's say it's a 24.5.5.1, and that's some website that you try to use. Well, if you try to go to that website, but you use that public IP range on your internal network, your firewall will say, oh, well, that website's internal, right? But it's not, right? It's on the internet. You need to get out to the internet, not stay internal. So that's why that's one reason why you don't use public IPs for your internal network. So anyway, subnetting is a massive topic. You can break it all the way down into binary and do all the ones and zeros and all that manual calculation if you feel like learning all that. I did learn all of that way back in the day, and it was quite painful. But, looking back, I'm glad that I learned it. I'm glad that I learned binary and understand, kind of how that works and how the computer translates binary, right? It's just interesting. So that's a little more about IP addresses and subnets. So again, I would highly recommend studying those subnets, studying the IPv6 address space, understanding why that's being used. We ran out of public IP addresses on the internet. Everybody's got a website nowadays, right? So there's only so many IP addresses. Well, they finally had to say, oh, we need more IPs, and that's why IPv6 came out. So let's dive into more about ports and protocols and services. So ports are also another very big thing to try to memorize as many as you can. There's 65,575 ports total, if I've got that number right. There's a lot of different ports you can use. And there are specific port assignments for various services. So for example, HTTP, which is typically your web services, that runs on port 80. But HTTPS, which is the encrypted and secure version of HTTP, runs on port 443. So understanding what ports these run on is very important because, when you're trying to secure your network, one of the things you want to try to do is do what's called zero trust everywhere you can. So you don't just want to open up all ports and all IP addresses and, just open everything wide open. Ideally, in a perfect world, you're going to limit what ports and what IP addresses can talk to each other. And so this goes, for your internal network, but also anything coming in from the external side and anything going out as well. I think a lot of network security gets overlooked on the outbound side. So typically, in most cases, a lot of companies leave outbound traffic just wide open because it's going out. And they're like, oh, I don't care where it goes. However, that can actually be a little dangerous in certain situations, especially with ransomware. They like to use SMB protocol externally. And so if you allow outbound SMB protocol, that can actually lead to a ransomware attack in some cases, right? So this is where, again, understanding those ports, understanding the services that run on those ports, and understanding which ones your company uses and which ones you don't use, and blocking what you don't use, only allowing the ones that you do. And this also gets into, blocking and allowing certain websites. So a lot of firewalls nowadays will allow you to do URL category blocking. So you can block everything in a specific category. So let's say I want to block social media. Well, you go into your firewall, you go into your URL filtering, you check a box for social media, you hit save. Now everything that's social media is going to be blocked. Now they have that for a lot of other categories. They have it for, guns and violence and adult things and, you name it. There's a lot of different categories. Now, the only issue there is that's not perfect because someone has to maintain that list of, of sites that they've classified. So every time a new website gets built and put on the internet, well, someone has to, and I'm sure by now it's either AI or it's some sort of machine that's going out and scanning these sites and trying to figure out what they are. But regardless, they have to maintain those lists and those categories of different sites. So it's not going to be perfect, but it will block the vast majority of social media, for example. And so that's all going to typically run over port 443. So you don't want to block port 443 outbound. You definitely want to leave that so people can actually communicate to and from different websites. But you're probably not going to need SMB protocol going outbound. If you don't want people connecting to, let's say, an SSH server outbound, you could block port 22. If you don't want people using FTP or Telnet or anything like that, you could also block those ports outbound. Now, inbound is another story. So outbound traffic, again, is usually left alone. And I would recommend at least reviewing that to make sure that's really what you want to do. But inbound traffic to your internal network is really where you want to be highly protective. You want to block any and everything inbound that you possibly can. Now, in some cases, you cannot do that. Let's say your company runs their website from an internal web server. Okay, great. Well, what you would ideally do is put that web server in its own little separate network. We typically call it a DMZ that doesn't touch any of your other internal network. So it's off kind of on its own little island. So that particular web server, it's on its own little island, and you can open up the port to that web server, the port 443 or whatever other ports it needs. So that's ideally what you would do with, anything inbound. Now, if you need to open up other ports inbound, again, you want to make sure that you've, put those in a DMZ so they're not, you're not opening that port to your entire internal network, right? You want to open the port to a very specific server internally. I want to open SSH to my internal SSH server in its own little island over here, own little network, subnet. That way it's not, if that web server or that SSH server or whatever gets compromised, they can't turn around and then access the rest of your internal network. That's why you'd put it in its own DMZ little island by itself. So, inbound is highly important to understand, but then again, memorizing or trying to memorize what ports run on, what services run on each port. So port 80, 443, 22, 21, 23, all those, it's good to know what services run on those ports. Otherwise, you'll be having to, look them up all the time and oh, what does that port do again? So it's easier if you just have them in your head and you can quickly and easily understand, oh, you're trying to run SMB outbound? Nope, I'm not going to let you do that, right? So try to get those, at least the ones that are, well defined, specifically like HTTP, HTTPS, FTP, Telnet, SSH, all those that are very, very commonly used, I would say, are the ones you really want to try to make sure that you've got memorized as best you can. Okay, so that's quite a bit of just IPs and ports. So let's try to change gears here a little bit. What do you do if you want to investigate some of your network traffic and try to analyze what's happening? Well, there's a few different tools that you can use. Oftentimes your firewall is probably your best source for that type of information. Now, in some cases, if what you're trying to investigate doesn't actually traverse the firewall or go through the firewall, then you may have to use another tool. And the most common tool for this is called Wireshark. Now, Wireshark is a packet capture tool. So it's basically going to capture network packets going across your network and allow you to analyze each and every packet. Now, this can be very, very challenging because there are millions of packets going across your network, most likely. So there are filters that you can apply and all kinds of other things, but Wireshark, again, is typically your go-to tool for that. Some other things that you kind of want to learn about too, especially when it comes to firewalls. And if you have a home lab, which I also highly recommend you set one up, a home lab of some sort. And if you know anybody that's getting rid of an old desktop computer or even an old laptop, and they're just oh, this thing's too old, I don't want it. Do you want it? Take it from them, because you can use that in your home lab, and it'll help you learn how to set all these things up. And once you learn how to set these up, it's easier to understand how to secure them, right? So there are open source firewalls that you can deploy to an old desktop computer, for example. One of those is OpenSense, OPN, and then Sense. OpenSense is probably the most common open source firewall out there. There are others. OpenWRT is another one. And you've even got others like pfSense, who offer a community edition of their firewall. Whichever one you decide to use, I would highly recommend downloading one of these and just learning, just tinkering with it. Now, you may need to go and buy an additional network adapter for that old laptop, right? You may have to go buy a PCI Express network adapter for that old desktop computer so that you've got more than one network adapter. But once you do that, you can deploy these firewalls, this firewall software, and really start diving into all these different settings I've been talking about this whole time on all these different podcasts. There's so many different things to learn. And these open source firewalls, they do pretty much everything we've discussed so far. Now, it's not quite going to be to the level of a commercial grade like Cisco or Palo Alto firewall. It's of course not going to be at that level. However, you can at least learn a lot of the basics and get a really good understanding for how to open up ports on your firewall, for how to forward different ports. You can learn about network address translation. You can set up firewall rules. You can do packet inspection. You can use different tools like Snort and Suricata to really analyze, from a security perspective, analyze the traffic crossing your firewall. So if you don't have a home lab, I would just highly recommend trying to set up some sort of home. You can even do a lot of this with a Raspberry Pi in a lot of cases, right? So just very simple, fairly cheap hardware. And even, I think they've even got like little microcomputers or mini computers, not even Raspberry Pi. It's just like small little, I guess you can call them desktop computers on Amazon for like $150, $200. So if you have nothing to start with, you don't have any old stuff laying around, well, go out to Amazon and buy one. Buy a real cheap Raspberry Pi or some sort of small form factor desktop computer, right? And again, this is just going to help you with installing. You can also use that lab computer to install different operating systems. You can install Linux on there and tinker around with that. You can put Windows on it. So many different things that you can learn on your own. And it's extremely important to try to do some of that learning and discovery on your own, because most people are tactile learners. You're going to learn by doing. I can sit here and talk all day, but at the end of the day, you're going to have to probably put these things into action to really let it sink into your brain and really learn it, right? Because hearing words being spoken to you or even reading words on paper oftentimes isn't enough for people to fully grasp and understand exactly how things are working. So again, highly recommend a home lab. Go out there and get OpenSense. I use OpenSense personally. I think it's a great open source firewall. I've used pfSense too. pfSense is also great. pfSense, though, recently has gone to a different model for their firewall software. So they require you to register an account, and it's still technically free with the community edition, but there's a few more hoops to jump through, so it's a little annoying. But OpenSense and I think it's OpenWRT is the other one that I mentioned. But anyway, OpenSense is probably your most common and probably the most user-friendly, I would say. pfSense is decent on the user-friendly front, but I would say OpenSense is a little more user-friendly. And there's tutorials galore on YouTube about how to set up different things within your OpenSense firewall. So again, highly recommend doing that so you can learn, again, how to set up all these different firewall rules, put these controls in place, and learn about the different security modules that even OpenSense has, right? There's so many to dive into. But when you get your home lab set up, I would highly recommend learning how to open a port on that firewall and make sure that that port only goes to a specific internal IP address. So you may have to set up a switch and a secondary computer. And then you're going to want to run some tests. You're going to want to use a tool like Nmap, which is Network Mapper, but you can use Nmap for all kinds of different things. But it'll help you also learn, Nmap also helps you learn all about the different ports and protocols that are running on things. And Nmap is also a very common security tool that's used as well. I know Wireshark is also more on like the network side, but Nmap's more on the, I guess, security side, if you want to call it that. But Nmap is very common, and it helps you understand, hey, this port is open, and it's reaching, this internal IP range, whatever it is. It'll just help you understand how things are laid out. So you can basically validate your configuration. So once you set up your home lab, you open a port on the firewall to a specific internal web server, for example, run some tests with Nmap. Make sure it's actually set up the way you think it is. And make sure that you can't get to any other systems in that internal subnet that you've set up. Okay, I know we're kind of running out of time here, so I do want to dive into a little bit more on firewalls, but we're approaching the 30-minute mark here, so I may have to expand on this more on the next episode. However, learn about network address translation, or NAT. You'll hear that a lot, but NAT is basically you're translating typically one to many. So the one IP address is your public IP address, and it's translating that to many internal IP addresses. That's the most common use case for NAT, or network address translation. And that's used because you only need one public IP address on the internet typically to be able to just browse the internet. Now, if you have a bunch of web services set up, that's a different story. You need more than one public IP. but you still need to NAT that public IP to an internal IP address. So that's where NAT really comes into play. Also highly recommend, along with the ports and protocols, learning about packet inspection, and that's typically on your firewall as well, and learning and understanding how that works. And there's a lot of tools out there. Suricata is one that you can get in OpenSense, as well as Snort. Those are probably the two. There are others, don't get me wrong. Those are probably the two, I guess, most available and more open source packet inspection tools that you can look at. So highly recommend checking those out. And then also on your firewall, learn about the IDS and the IPS, the intrusion detection and intrusion prevention, and learn how that works, and then how to set that up, and what rules you can set up to help block certain types of traffic. You can even block certain countries. If you say, hey, I don't want anybody in North Korea to be able to, even reach my firewall whatsoever. So you can put in various types of firewall rules that would block anything coming from that country's public IP space. So anyway, there's a lot more to dive into on network security. So I am going to pause here, and we'll try to pick this back up next week. We'll dive a little bit more into some firewall settings, more into IDS, IPS, and then also want to talk a little bit about how to forward those logs from your firewall to a SIEM. So we'll dive into that a little bit too. But that's it for today. Appreciate everybody listening. We'll check in again next week.